Hello, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's team is myself. I am one of our project relations people at TQ Construction. And we also have Michelle joining us. She's one of our executive assistants at TQ. It would not be possible without her.
Well, our whole team here. So, thank you everyone for joining us today. And yes, welcome to today's webinar, Beyond the Budget, the Unexpected Cost of Your Renovation or New Builds. And a few things to mention. We are going to be sending a recorded version of this webinar within a day or two in a follow-up email, as mentioned. So we will ask that you look out for that. To respect our presenter and our attendees, we ask that everyone stay muted during this presentation of this webinar. We will have a Q&A at the end, and you can feel free to ask questions then, or you can pop them in that chat down below there, and we will address it at the end of this webinar. And so we ask that you do feel free to yeah, ask all those questions. We will have Megan here start, and she's our project relations at TQ Construction and our presenter and host of today's webinar.
And without further ado, so just jumping into it. So for those of you who have attended multiple of these webinars, you'll be familiar with the way that we generally set it up, where we've got our table of contents, all of our topics that we are going to go through this evening. Then we go through them all, and then we just do like a quick little recap and then Q&As. So the topics this evening are may as wells, home systems, development permit, building permit, hazmat remediation, demolition and excavation, landscaping and hardscaping, taxes, duties, and tariffs. And so those are the kinds of topics that we'll be talking about in terms of where you might find unexpected costs or costs that you didn't necessarily budget for through the course of construction. Particularly when you're doing a lot of your like initial interviewing process. So the may as well sort of things that you want to kind of keep just like in the back of your mind as you start going through and planning your project are very much like the cost of getting excited. So as you start planning your project, you're really excited, and there's like the really obvious like just like throwing everything at the board and getting really, really excited about all of your different options and possibilities. Um, there's also the other one, which I find to be these last two to be the most difficult, which is when you're adding small scopes of work, either throughout the course of design or through the course of construction, where you're just like slowly adding little bits and you don't necessarily notice how they add up. And then you get to a point where it's added up a lot and it becomes very shocking suddenly. Then you can move into like home systems. So the examples that we have here are like electrical system service upgrades where you may not be anticipating needing to do an electrical service upgrade to your home. You might be anticipating that your existing electrical service will be fine, and then you get through, redesigning a big portion of your home and you realize that your existing electrical service is already maxed out or very close to getting maxed out, or you want to future proof your home. And then, you know, making sure that you have that budget there for that. So, if you talk to BC Hydro, it doesn't, from their end of things, it does not cost very much. It costs maybe a couple $1,000s. Talk to an electrician, it costs them, you know, somewhere in the vicinity of $8,000 to $12,000, depending on, where it is on your home, on your property, how to integrate it into your existing system. The other things that you really want to think about is, okay, well, how do I need to integrate this into other things? Am I going to get pulled into, installing a new EV charger? Am I getting pulled in different directions by these things? Other things are like other kinds of mechanical systems and home systems, such as like your HVAC, your hot water, things like that, where they're things that really start to make sense to do certain upgrades depending on how much of your home you're touching or how old those systems are, and making sure that you address them accordingly. The other one is obviously with HVAC is air conditioning, because then it often quickly turns from conversation about adding air conditioning to straight to like, well, obviously that's a heat pump conversation now, right? In our modern situation. And so it becomes like, okay, can our existing electrical panel handle that? Can our existing furnace handle a heat pump situation? Do we need to do some sort of an update? So those are the kinds of things that we need to consider with a mechanical system, as well as, and then you kind of get into other things like home automation and appliances and how fancy do we get with those things. So it really depends on what you want your end user experience to be, how fancy you want to get with it, all of those things. The next kind of thing that we kind of hit is when we start moving into like development permit fees. So one of the things that we'll see, and these are things that we tend to see more with when we are developing a lot. So when we're dealing with new builds, whether that's a multiplex, whether that's a laneway house or a new home construction, when we're dealing with those things, we do tend to see, where we'll start to see calculated transit fees or development permit fees depending on the city's annual decision on how to calculate those fees. Um, we've just gone through the process ourselves of putting in for a development permit. We put in at the end of last year, but they did like all the turnaround for it and everything this year. And the way that they pull the numbers and calculate them are a little bit arbitrary sometimes. This particular construction is in the city of Vancouver, and so everybody kind of knows their own experiences with the city of Vancouver and how frustrating that can be. Um, and that kind of goes to a certain degree in all municipalities. Some municipalities are more transparent with their development and building permit fees. Others are less so. The other thing is too is that you do have to pay to demolish your building. Other than the actual costs of demolishing your building, which we'll talk about in a second here, but you do have to pay for a permit specifically to demolish your building. Um, and some of those things, like a lot of application fees and things like that, because the city changes them so often, it is often a good idea to have like a little bit of a padding in your budget for those things, depending on the type of development you're doing. Like with a new home, it might be a good idea to have like an extra five to $10,000 for dealing with the city, aside from like any other upgrades. For larger development projects, it's a good idea to kind of have a larger amount or ask a few questions before as you're putting in your permit. And then when you move into building permit fees, you might be looking at some water and sewer upgrades. If you're doing any kind of new construction, you're almost most certainly looking at it unless it was done recently. Um, if you're doing a renovation, it's like if you're adding more than a certain number of plumbing fixtures or plumbing points rather than fixtures, you'll have to do one. Or if you're basically changing like renovating more than a certain portion of your home. Um, you might also be looking at like some conditional approval fees, which kind of line up with the development fees, but on the building permit side, because they are the same but different. And then you also might be looking at energy requirements. So different kinds of things that the cities might be requiring that you meet certain energy requirements according to the BC Building Code, and our step code, moving through that entire process. Part of your demo is hazmat, so hazardous materials remediation. So when you're doing any kind of demo for this shows demolishing an existing home for a complete new build that we did, but it actually does apply to renos as well. Is that if you're demoing a significant portion of your home and your home is basically built before the year 2000 that you're demolishing or demoing portions of, you have to get it tested for hazardous materials. The common ones in BC are asbestos and lead paint. Those are the main ones that we see. And then once you've got that testing, you have to submit it to for when you get rid of the materials. So you can't just like go and dump your drywall. You have to have that hazmat test showing whether it's clean or not. If it's not clean, then it does need to be remediated properly by the appropriate people with the appropriate suits and everything. They get all suited up and they tent everything, they spray everything down, and they make sure it's all good to go and safe to work with. And then you go in and you start your clean demo. So once you kind of get into your clean demo, you're really just removing everything that doesn't have your hazmat materials. You might be looking at, what might be eligible for material recycling these days. A lot of people like to look at, can we repurpose some of the lumber? Are we able to recycle the existing appliances and are they able to get further life? And then, you might be looking at also once you get everything demolished and everything, okay, what kind of excavation volumes are we looking at? How much dirt do we need to remove for the new, structure that's going there? How much might need to be brought back? How much fill might need to be brought back? And these are kind of unknowns at the site where you might find it's super unusual, but sometimes you find like tanks and stuff that are in the ground. It's very, very unusual. And most of the time, most homeowners know about it when they purchase their properties because they're pretty well documented. And then once you kind of get into the point of, okay, you've built most of your building, all of the things that have been like properly accounted for and that everybody kind of thinks about as being a part of their building, you get into the hardscaping and landscaping parts of it. So there's often a bit of a fuzzy line in terms of how much is included by a contractor in terms of the hardscaping and landscaping. So it's something to consider in terms of like where does it stop between your house and your property? So obviously you have to excavate all of this land and fill a bunch of it back in and then build this structure. And then you have to figure out how you want to deal with the rest of it. Do you just want a lawn? Sorry. Do you want to have bushes? Do you want nice concrete planters? Is it a part, like, is it an architectural feature of the home that you originally planned for and expected? In which case, if it is, making sure that those things are properly accounted for in your budgeting and that they're tied in properly to your structure so that they don't cause water ingress issues. And also with any kind of like densification project. So if you've got a new home and you've got a laneway or you're doing a multiplex and things like that, your municipality more often than not will require a certain amount of landscaping or hardscaping to create separate outdoor spaces for each of the individual living spaces. And so you do want to make sure that those are properly accounted for because contractors don't always consider that to be a part of their scope and budget because it's often handled by homeowners after the project is complete. And then the big, heavy, interesting one right now is, considering things like taxes, duties, and then the hot button topic right now, which is tariffs. So the first one, taxes. So GST and PST, it really depends on how your contractor kind of deals with those. Most contractors will give you a price that does not include GST because we're not like we pass that GST directly onto the government. It doesn't pass through for TQ, for example, it doesn't pass through TQ, it passes over TQ. We take it and we hand it straight over to them. PST is a little bit different though because we're not PST exempt. And most general contractors aren't exactly PST exempt. So any materials that they're purchasing, it becomes a question of just like really understanding your invoicing and how and where that shows up. And also, is there GST that you need to account for separately in your initial quoting process as you're talking to contractors, just so you don't get surprised by those bottom lines as you're adding up your bills, as everyone naturally does at some point. The other thing to consider is like any kind of imports or duties on foreign items. These are things that are usually affected by things that are like overseas items. Um, it's really just about kind of having those conversations with your designer as they kind of go through and help you spec everything and get everything priced. Everyone has like their own relationships, which we've talked about before in other webinars with their suppliers and in terms of getting their own specific contractor discounts. Um, but you might still have some sort of imported fees and whatnot. And so you just want to make sure that those are transparent and appropriately accounted for. And that, again, they don't become a surprise later on down the road because they are considered a tax that is kind of, again, a flow through cost that your contractors not really may not consider themselves responsible for, I guess is the best way to put it. And then the big one is tariffs. Right now, it's a big, like, hot button topic. And so I just wanted to kind of like touch on it kind of briefly. I'm not an expert by any means of like in terms of with tariffs. Like I'm not a political expert. I'm not a financial taxes expert. So if you want to get like a really great understanding, I would engage with someone who has definitely like a very solid understanding in tariffs. But my understanding of tariffs is that, and based on like conversations I've had with other colleagues, is that, you know, the country that imposes the tariff, that country's citizens is the one who pays that tariff on the incoming items that that tariff describes. So how that might affect your project is, you know, if there's tariffs that Canada imposes on items coming in from other places. And I mean, really the major thing is that the entire industry is aware of it. So the first aspect is that there's actually a lot more that's produced in Canada than, or that is able to be produced in Canada and sourced in Canada than a lot of people were maybe thinking before or aware of before. And now we're just being a lot more conscious about it. Like I went to a furniture store this morning with a colleague of mine with our interior designer, and we're like walking around, and the lady who was giving us the tour and telling us about everything, she was really on it about knowing where certain things were coming from, what was being produced locally, right down to like, is it in Ontario? Is it in Quebec? Is it made from imported materials? What's coming from Europe? What's coming from the States? Um, Fun fact, a lot of furniture is made in North Carolina. um, so kind of just being aware of where you're sourcing things from and what you might be able to avoid tariffs in and what you aren't able to avoid tariffs in. And that's really kind of what it comes down to is just being aware of where all of the different costs can potentially be and then just knowing to ask the right questions so that you find out about them early enough that you can adjust the rest of your project accordingly. And those are really the major areas where we see extra costs kind of come up that surprise people or have the potential to surprise people. Um, it really comes down to like things that contractors like they're really large variables where contractors are unsure of, you know, where the stop and start position is of them. And so you just want to make sure that through your planning process, you have a really clear concept of where you want them to be and you know to at least ask the questions so that if you're not sure of where, for example, your landscaping and hardscaping should start and stop with your contractor and where you should pick that up, you can account for that conversation with your contractor and make sure that what you want them to cover is accounted for in your budgeting early on. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any hands.
I don't see any questions in the chat box right now.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for being so great about keeping themselves muted and everything. Particularly, I noticed that one person kind of joined halfway through and they were pretty quick to mute themselves. I'd just like to thank everyone for their vigilance on that. It's really helpful.
Sorry, yeah, I joined late. I was wondering what is hardscaping?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So hardscaping is like sidewalks and like those really big like concrete planters and it's kind of like landscaping, but it's more like physically solid items, really is the answer. Um, so like your landscaping is like trees and bushes and gardens and pathways. And your hardscaping is when you've got like retaining walls and planters and um, like made of physically dense materials, I guess. They're just different trades and contractors who do them, so it's described in a separate scope of work.
Oh, okay. I guess that's not usually included in the building permit stuff.
Well, and this is where you have to be kind of careful and really ask the questions because especially when you start moving into densification, it definitely is because it's something that moves into like the clarification of having those separate outdoor living spaces, like I was mentioning. But also with hardscaping, you do have to take into consideration because most municipalities don't want you to have more than a certain percentage of the property to be covered with um like they want the water to be able to pass through. My brain is glitching right now and not remembering the permeable. There we go. They don't want more than a certain percentage to be covered by non-permeable surfaces. So it's just a matter of making sure, like for example, that's part of why you're only technically allowed driveways to be more than a certain amount and things like that. Because, or if you do have driveways that are larger than a certain amount, most municipalities now actually want you to have like a permeable driveway so that the rain can pass through and be absorbed by the land properly.
What about artificial grass? Is that
Um,
permeable?
depends on the artificial grass. I think for the most part, it's considered to be permeable because most artificial grasses are designed to allow moisture to pass through. I think it depends on the specs. Did that
Okay.
answer your question? Yeah,
Yeah, no, thank you.
perfect.
And then, Megan, we have a few more questions in the chat box.
Perfect.
We have Hayden asking, is there PST or GST on city permits?
No, she says with a question mark. I'm fairly certain the answer is no, but let me pull one up quickly because I have one that's easy to look at quickly that was sent to me, and I will
Mhm.
tell you. Because
And
I wouldn't think so because they are their own. No, there is not. At least not in Vancouver. They're just because they are a tax in and of themselves. So there are no taxes applied to any of the permit fees that I'm looking at from the city of Vancouver. I doubt any of the other municipalities do either.
and then we have a second question too. The
Love it.
The second question is, what is a street use permit?
Okay, so a street use permit is when you have to either park or store something on the street in front of the property for a long-term period. So in our case, it's used for like if we're going to have to be making a lot of deliveries or if we need to have a storage container to store things safely in around site when there's going to be a lot of excavation. Sometimes we're able to keep things on the site itself, but especially when you're either doing a really major renovation or if you're doing a new build, more often than not, you need a street use permit for a significant period of time. And then with renovations, you might need one for only a short period of time, depending on what your scope of work is. In some renovations, you don't need one at all. So it really depends on your project. But it's basically you renting the right to have something on the street for an extended period of time.
And we have a few more questions. Amanda here had wondering about some of the costs for demolition and remediation. Is it a set fee and then additional fees depending on size or weight of what's being demolished or removed?
Very much more towards the second half of that, which is so for starting with like remediation, what happens is that you get the test done, which tells you how much hazardous material is in the home, um, and where it's located and what type it is. Because like for example, just like quick mini backstory, interesting fun fact, I guess I don't know how to classify it, but like you can find asbestos in vermiculite, which is often used in a lot of homes as like attic insulation. You can also find it in like ducting tape. You can also find it in the glue for like old vinyl glue downs, or laminate glue downs. So like flooring. You can also find it in drywall compound. And all of those things have different risk levels associated to them in terms of what's the process for removing it and how intensive is that. Um, so that's one half of it is like how much of it is there and how difficult slash dangerous is it to remediate. And then the other half of it is that we don't, and I think again we've talked about this in a few other webinars, we don't actually have a place in BC where we keep hazardous materials and deal with them to be like in terms of like long-term storage and long-term remediation. So all of that gets either like trained or trucked out to Alberta. So another big portion of it, depending on your volume, is just like straight up transportation of that stuff out there. So once you get your report done with all of your hazardous materials, then it gets quoted out with like hazmat demolition contractors. Often contractors will try and control those costs by also awarding them some clean demo as well, so non-hazardous materials demolition as well, which just makes the job more valuable and helps kind of control the costs of the hazmat because they've got their guys there and they're able to make a little bit more money. So we're able to cut down on some of their overhead for it. Which is just kind of an up for everybody. It's an up for our team, it's an up for our clients, and it's an up for the that contractor. And then of course size has to do with it because it's very much like a quantities based game. And then for demo, like clean demo in general, like yes, you're totally right. There would be like a base cost for bringing your machines to site. And then like how long do they need to get it all out? It also has to do with the complexity of how difficult is that site to access. So for example, the house that we were actually looking at the picture of on the demo slide, that site was quite like it was a hill. So everything about delivering to that site, demoing that site, excavating that site, like everything about that site was extra expensive because of the nature of the lot. Whereas to another site that is nice and flat and has no trees and easy access front and back, let's go, folks, a lot less expensive.
Megan, we have a few more questions
Yeah.
coming through. And so, kind of going in the order of it, first, another question is, should you get a demo permit before a building permit, or is it cheaper and or faster to get them together?
It's more like you have to get them together. You have to get them together because cities don't like empty lots. So you apply for your demolition permit or your development, really more kind of like your development permit. And then at some point, you get permission to do your abatement and kind of start your demolition, but you're not allowed to knock over your house until you get your building permit because municipalities don't like empty lots, apparently. Even though I see them all over the place. Somehow, some people are getting away with it, but we're not allowed to, apparently. It's usually, I think, usually where we see like the really big empty lots is for large municipal projects where you've got large development, multifamily, mixed use, those kinds of things. I think the process for those is a little bit more dragged out, and you are allowed to have empty lots with those. But for residential and like neighborhoods and stuff like that, they like to avoid it wherever they can. They don't want a big hole in the ground either, right? Like nobody wants to fill in that hole just to unfill that hole to build a house. Like it's there's a bunch of like liability stuff.
Right. And then another question here. On average, what percentage of your projects run over budget?
Um, for us, I'm not sure exactly what that percentage is. We do a fairly decent job of running pretty close to where our budgets should be. What we tend to see is we'll tend to see like a little bit of overages or underages in different areas of our projects and where it comes out pretty close, like within like a very reasonable margin. I don't personally have like the exact numbers. Where we will see overages is usually in change orders, where the client has very consciously added large portions of scope, or where we have had a contemplated change order where we've said, okay, we're going to not include this in our initial construction agreement cost, and we're going to have a conversation about this later at the appropriate time. And one that's a really good conversation about that is landscaping. That's one where with newer projects that we say, okay, let's deal with how far we want to go with this near the end of the project. Another one is where a better example is obviously renovations versus new homes, but where sometimes we'll get into the throes of a renovation and some clients will be like, you know what? Screw it. Let's just do the other bathroom as well at the same time. Or they'll say, you know what? Screw it. Let's just do all the flooring in this level. And then that's an added scope of work. So it's a little bit, it's not as simple as like how many of our projects run over because that's not entirely accurate to like how close are we running to our budget versus what our original budget was, because a lot of it is actually like very conscious decisions that our clients are making.
And then on to our next question here. Hayden asks, is there additional cost involved if I want to have the materials recycled or reused? For example, if I am demolishing a kitchen, can I send the cabinets, if reusable, to organizations like Habitat for Humanity? And how much do you estimate this to the cost?
So if we're managing it for you, it's really just our additional time. So just kind of taking a look at a given project and being like, how much extra coordination is this going to take? If you're having someone like Habitat for Humanity do it, typically they'll come and tell you what is like what they'll take and what they won't take. Um, and then they'll just come and take it for the most part. Even like, for example, with older homes, something that we'll look into sometimes is like Nickel Brothers will like take a whole house off of a foundation if it's, if it fits the criteria, if they can get it easily off of the foundation, if they can take it easily away from the property, and they'll just take it for free. You still have to kind of like disconnect it from the foundation, but yeah, they'll take it and then they'll sell it for, ten or $20,000 and someone else will fix it up and refinish it or plop it on a new foundation or whatever have you. um, where you get into more of like the cost of recycling materials is when you might be looking at stripping out all of the lumber in a house if you're demoing a whole home. And then it's just about getting out that quote and finding out how expensive that is. But then the other aspect of that is that I do believe that it's like a tax rebate or something. There is an upside. There's a financial upside to doing that for the client.
Okay. Mhm. And we have another question here. Can you get money for the copper or metal in a house demo?
Definitely. That does fall into like the whole like recycling thing. You definitely want to kind of talk to your contractor about how that's being handled and whatnot. Because there is like again, there's the coordination and stripping and all of that that's associated. Um, but it is possible to. Yes, it just becomes a question of like, is it worth going through? Like, is it your worth kind of spending the extra effort of getting it to get that money, depending on like what the process is for your home and when it was built and all of that, um, versus like someone else who basically like goes to a demo yard and like strips it all and does it. There's
Then we
potential there, and the industry is definitely getting better about it too, like recycling, reusing, upcycling, all of that. It's becoming evident that we have to be better at it.
And then we have two more questions, and one of them is, what kind of insurance do you need for demolition?
So as a general we have like our general liability insurance that we get, and that's like as a company. And then when we do work for, and Michelle can kind of actually probably speak to this almost better than I can because she's the one who actually fills in the applications. But you get course of construction insurance for properties where the homeowners will not be living on the property or in the building during the course of construction in case something happens to the property while no one is there. And it kind of covers everybody's butts, but basically, typically, your general contractor should have like all of their buttons in a row in terms of their insurance that covers everything. And because you're hiring a general contractor, they're the ones who are ultimately liable. Um, and then the course of construction insurance kind of is the bridge gap for, if someone falls in a hole, even though they were evidently not supposed to be on the property, there was fencing and everything, and someone broke in and fell in a hole, and then was like, well, I'm going to sue you anyway. Like, that's what that course of construction insurance helps cover. It also covers, like, the house is 50% or 70% built, and something horrific happens and the whole thing burns down, and now you have to rebuild the whole thing. That's also what course of construction helps cover. So,
That's pretty much. And then one final question here. If there are additional questions, feel free to email us to me or reply to our follow-up email with the recording copy, and then we can also follow up from there. The
for
final
sure.
question we have here is, in your projects, do you budget for these unexpected expenses so they are no longer unexpected?
We do our very best to, and we try to ask a lot of questions up front. So, they may not be always necessarily, so we have a couple different phases in our, I guess, budgeting process. And our initial phase might be like our initial assessment, where we sit down and we go, okay, what could our project potentially possibly be? And what are some potential associated costs along with those? And so if we go back one slide, this is why we do this. We have this slide here so that it's easy to find and I don't have to go back to the beginning of the entire thing. But if we go back here, we really do our best to include like all of the development permit and building permit costs to the best of our ability. Sometimes the city surprises us and we really do our best. We try and ask them as soon as possible. We inquire with them as soon as possible. Sometimes they don't answer our questions. Sometimes they outright don't answer our questions. Sometimes they answer them cryptically. Sometimes they send us a web link that's like 30 pages long and really doesn't make any sense. Um, so we really do try to uh, like account for those properly in our design and planning phases of any given project. The may as well things are really a little bit more difficult. What we try to do is we try to be really diligent about properly raising those flags for our clients. When they say, I want to add this, and we go, okay, this is what it will cost outside of our existing budget. Are you cool with that? And just like allowing our clients to make really educated decisions. And then, depending on our clients, some clients just want to be allowed to make their decisions and do whatever they want to do. Power to them. I'm here to support you. Other clients really want us to tap them on the shoulder and be like, hey, we're going outside of that area that you said you wanted me to keep you in. Do you want me to make you stay inside the area? And so that's another aspect of like our jobs and making sure that we just have a really good relationship with our clients on, again, making educated decisions. It kind of goes along well with like home systems. Some of it is figuring some of those answers out through the design process and when we're getting quoting from our trades and getting all of those calculations done and everything. We're a pretty well educated team, but we still need to check with, our electrician to make sure that everything's cool and dandy. And we do have processes for that before we hit like our building permit and development permit stage and a material selection stage. So the goal is to have as many of those questions answered as early on as possible, um, and to have as few surprises through the course of construction. Excavation is a difficult one because sometimes it's really difficult for even a geotech to specifically say how much soil is going to be needed to be removed. Um, so sometimes we'll have like, it ends up being like a contemplated change order of, we may or may not need to remove more dirt. Hazmat remediation is something that gets answered pretty quickly because we'll have to get the test done in order to submit for the permit with the city. And then we can get quoting done at the same time. Um, and we can usually kind of, depending on the size of the home and depending on existing quotes that we've been getting back, we can kind of give you like an initial idea. This is how much we should generally ish budget for based on other projects and scopes of work that we've been getting back. We do have your best interests in heart. I like to remind people that if you're not happy, we're not happy. Like if you're not happy and the project doesn't go through, or you're not happy and the project's happening and you're miserable, like we definitely are not happy.
And then I know that I said that was the final question. There's two more that just came in. See how kind of gauging if we can kind of address those questions. Maybe that's it. One
Yeah,
question. Yeah, one question is, let's see here. Is there an average of new build cost per square footage for average builder spec homes?
we're not an average builder spec. We're not an average spec builder. So I'm going to say we don't have those numbers. We are a custom home builder, and I would say that our numbers fall somewhere between $450 a square foot and $600 a square foot, typically. If you want to spend more than that, we will more than happily help you spend more than that. But I've been typically seeing people somewhere in the 500 to $550 a square foot range. And for more luxury builds, I've been seeing it creep up towards 650. I also know a lot of other custom home builders that like we run in the same circles with are running with the same kind of like cost per square foot. And I know of some luxury home builders who are also building higher than that. And I do know that spec builders build lower. I've heard numbers like 350 and 400, and I have my own opinions about how they reach those and how they get there. um, but that's just not the company that TQ is. We're building at a higher quality and we're building custom builds that are spec'd according to our clients' wants and needs and long-term use.
And then the final question here is home insurance still necessary when there's course of construction insurance?
Uh yes.
Believe
But you have
so.
yes,
Hmm.
it's just different. Like you talk to your insurance about it depends on like it'll depend on the type of project it is, first of all,
Hmm.
like if you're doing a complete reno versus a new build. Um, but yes, it is to some degree, and you'll have to talk to your home insurer about that. I also know that it's uh, a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more affordable when it's all through the same insurance company, just because then everybody can just it's one company talking to each other. But yeah, you do need to have your own insurance.
Hmm. Yep. believe that's it. Yeah, the best thing is really speaking with your insurance company and going from there.
Thanks,
And
Michelle.
I think yes, because it does really vary depending, obviously, informing them, explaining like the timeline of what is expected for the project, uh, of course, the scope of work, and they do adjust it accordingly. And yes, home insurance is it's just the coverage just to be safe, right? So, definitely can look into it more as needed. But for now, it seems like that's all the questions we have for today. And so, Megan,
Perfection.
yes. So
Thank
we
you
are
so much, everybody.
we will have another new webinar upcoming up.
I know we're actually hitting the next webinar is anticipated, the last webinar in our series. That doesn't mean like the last webinar period. Just means we're going to kind of restart our cycle again. We'll review them and review everything in them and see what needs to be updated and what can be improved and whatnot. But yeah, we have one more fresh webinar. For those of you who like to ask a question, the last couple times we have been asked, and I'm like, I don't know yet. But this time we do know. So I will be going through. My plan is to basically break out a construction schedule for a new build, just because like that's the most complete of a construction schedule. Just for like a single family home, I think is probably the best place to start, and then we can kind of conversationally extrapolate from there and then kind of go through the different phases and the timeframes that we would expect associated with those. Because a lot of people don't have necessarily a clear understanding of, why does drywall take so long, or why does excavation take so long, or why does cabinets take so long? Like, to take your pick, depending on what your background is and what your experience is, you may not have a clear understanding of um, how long those things take. So we're going to run through those next time.
Right. Thank you everyone for joining us this webinar and hope to see you at the next one.